Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SCA's 37th monthly Zoom presentation. We're now into our fourth year with no end in sight. My name is Brian Gallagher, and I am the Vice President of the Society for Commercial Archaeology. I will be your host tonight. Welcome to all our guests, and particularly followers of the Society of Architectural Historians Philadelphia chapter, Docomomo US, Philadelphia, the Doo-Wop Preservation League, and any other new people we have tonight. We're happy you took the time out of your spring evening to watch an SCA presentation. I hope you enjoy the show. And for anybody watching the recording of this episode of the SCA's monthly presentations who is not a member of the SCA, we earnestly ask you to consider joining. Funding for the various activities of the SCA comes almost exclusively from our membership. Just visit our website at www.sca-roadside.org and follow the links. Now I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's presentation. Architect and preservationist Daniel Vieyra and photographer Mark Havens will tell us about the rich mid-century modern motel architecture of Wildwood, New Jersey from two distinct viewpoints. Vieyra will discuss his preservation work with Stephen Eisenor on the 1990s design studios that cataloged, analyzed, and evaluated the motels. The project ultimately identified clusters that coherently told the story of Wildwood's evolution while allowing areas in between for new development. Havens will discuss his decade-long photography project documenting these structures that resulted in the monograph entitled Out of Season: The Vanishing Architecture of the Wildwoods. Daniel taught architecture for over 30 years in Ohio and is professor emeritus in the School of Architecture at Kent State University. He is the author of Fill Her Up, An Architectural History of America's Gas Stations. He organized the Society for Commercial Archaeology's 20th anniversary conference held in Wildwood, New Jersey. Daniel currently lives with his wife in the Philadelphia area. He serves on the board of the Society of Architectural Historians Philadelphia, and he is a board member of Docomomo Philadelphia. Mark Havens is an artist, designer, and educator. He's the associate director of the Industrial Design Program at Thomas Jefferson University. His book, Out of Season, is a chronicle of the rapidly vanishing motels of Wildwood, New Jersey. The New York Times described the work as a decade-long elegy, and Wallpaper magazine declared it a revolutionary architectural diary. Now, tonight we're going to try something a little different. We have a short video to play, but it might take a minute or so to get it set up. So just be patient and we will play the video, and then the presenters will come on and give their presentation.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. Performance is greatest. Nothing can beat it. Life is complete here in a Chevy. So make it ding. USA. See it in your Chevrolet. Traveling west, wherever you go, Chevy turns the best. Stop where you're going. Near place for Harvard, Chevrolet.
Hey, Brian, I think you need to share your screen.
Oh. Sorry, folks, I think we screwed it up. Let's try that again.
See the USA in your Chevrolet. America's asking you to call. Drive your Chevrolet through the USA. America's the greatest land of all. Nothing can beat it. Life is simply here in a Chevy, so make it taste today. USA, see it in your Chevrolet. Traveling east, traveling west, wherever you go, Chevy services best. South where north, this makes your heart better. Your Chevrolet dealer for your Chevrolet car. Take care of it, get yourself for Said it before, we'll say it again. For it's either true or not. Chevrolet is the one that proves the fun, the fun. The fun is in the going. Come rain or shine or snowing. The fun is in the going. In the slim, wide, fresh and fine Chevy. And the fun keeps growing as mile by mile. Your Chevy shows the fun is in the going. Chevrolet is really swinging. In a Chevy, you just can't help singing. Here's a car, there's six men singing. Oh, what fun for traveling in. And now, get this, the fun is in the knowing. The fun is in the going. So why don't you get going? Come on in and try a new Chevy.
Okay, I hope that came through, everybody. It's now time for our two presenters to take over. I'll ask Dan and Mark to share their screens. All right, there we go. Sorry for the technical issues, folks. We're not experts at this.
But thank you, Brian, and thank you for helping put together that sequence of the 4 Chevy ads that were variations on the same campaign that happens to coincide with the heyday of building in Wildwood. Just in case we weren't going to be able to do that, I do have this Buick ad. I stayed in the GM family, but I do have a Buick ad that shows the kind of higher tone car with its attendant architecture and a cartoon of the family on its way to Wildwood, presumably. But to begin the presentation, in the aftermath of World War II, the United States was virtually unchallenged as a world power. The economy was booming. The country reveled in a kind of opulence and innocent hedonism. A 1953 issue of House Beautiful promised its readers, "You will have the greater chance to be yourselves than any people in the history of civilization." And where better to be ourselves than at the Jersey Shore? Post-war prosperity, its attendant automobility, combined with the completion of the Garden State Parkway in 1955, opened the Wildwoods to a new wave of travelers with newfound leisure who took to the road in search of adventure and relaxation often within driving distance from home. A long-standing resort community with Victorian-era roots, located between flashy Atlantic City and Victorian Cape May, the towns collectively known as the Wildwoods reinvented themselves as an auto-oriented beach destination. The Wildwoods came to be known for their open beaches, great rides and boardwalks, as well as flamboyant and evocative motels. The physical redevelopment of the Wildwoods of the 1950s provided an answer in brick and mortar, actually it was in stucco and neon, to the pressing question that had occupied mid-century architects and critics regarding the future of American modernism. The result is what we have come to recognize as everyday modernism, sometimes called mom and pop modernism. And I'll run through 3 or 4 of these esteemed characters, starting with Henry Russell Hitchcock, co-author with Philip Johnson of the publication that accompanied the Museum of Modern Art's 1932 International Style Show, was among the first to see the promise of everyday roadside buildings for the future of modernism. Based on his eye-opening 1940 California road trip, this Eastern critic, as he called himself, famously predicted the emergence of a new, open quote, wildly popular commercial modernism. Douglas Haskell, the esteemed critic and editor of Architectural Forum, penned a 1958 piece entitled Architecture and Popular Taste, answering the question, is modern architecture molded by popular taste? He gave a resounding yes as he welcomed what he called a new American Baroque. John Brinkerhoff Jackson, the cultural geographer and editor of Landscape magazine, defined the honky-tonk itself. It's all about an architecture of hype, exaggeration, and fantasy and popular taste. All those flamboyant and deliberately bizarre decorative effects, Jackson wrote, are in fact a kind of folk art of mid-20th century garb. And now for our contemporaries, 60 years later, looking back on modernism from today's perspective, architect and author and SCA member Alan Hess concludes that even today, there is so much of modernist history that we don't know yet. We are only now redrawing the picture of what modern architecture is. This redrawn picture has come to be recognized as mom and pop modernism, a concept and a term championed by the late Stephen Eisenhower, principal at Venturi Scott Brown, and co-author with Bob and Denise of the seminal Learning from Las Vegas, itself an outgrowth of a studio that studied the architecture of Las Vegas. Everyday modernism is an application, some would argue a corruption, of high-style modernism that combines high style with populist low-style elements. To bring this back to Wildwood, as Steve Eisner explained, highfalutin European modernism went slumming, and it is the messy vitality of this combination that is the appeal of the Wildwood. And here we see a collage of ubiquitous buildings made unique. There are 2 basic building types. There's the corner motel that we see on the left, starting with a rooming house that was somewhat dressed up like a ship, making its way down to the undecorated, as we see it here, corner motel in the lower left. And then the other type is the beachfront high-rise, and actually that evolved naturally because the beach at Wildwood grew, unlike Cape May and other areas where the beach was eroding, all of the sand ended up at Wildwood, and so there was literally a new set of large, deep building lots and a very deep beach that made it possible for 2 generations of buildings to live together. The largest intact collection of this form of modernism existed until relatively recently in the Wildwoods. There, motels sprang up like weeds, or as Phil Patton prefers, beautiful wildflowers. These motels evolved from the corner motels that we saw that were typically intrusions into residential fabric to the high-rises that lined this new beachfront. And here we see pragmatic 2- and 3-story corner motels, where the most efficient way to get a family into a room, their car parked right outside, while offering pool and lounge deck amenities. The beachfront buildings focused on transitioning from auto arrival to beach living. Since both types were based on a consistent basic prototype, differentiation of the product was achieved by the use of flamboyant decoration that manifested itself in railings, roof lines, fins, and other applied ornament that complemented the signs, porte-cocheres, and exotic names from faraway places, both real and imagined. And here we see a sampling of them that we will come back to. But in the lower left, you see the Chateau Bleu motel that is really just a simple corner motel that manages to reach out toward the street and beckon you in with a pretty elegant porte-cochere. Here, a little more serious architecture of the inverted roof that also can be looked at as a seagull. And here again, and finally the Caribbean that has a auto-oriented spin on Morris Lapidus's famous stairs to nowhere in his Miami Beach hotels that actually led to no big spaces, but made a great setting for family portraits and wedding portraits. In Wildwood, the consistent ornament in this often chaotic panoply was the plastic palm. These trees typically grew out of distinctly non-Corbusian roof decks, usually perched above car parking and adjoining the swimming pool. It's not only the architecture, but it's what's in a name. In fact, Mark Havens and I played a game a while back, and we kind of tried to play a geography identifying these. And it's quite a challenge. It keeps you busy because you have the Stade, Cape Cod, and the Tangiers all in the same streetscape. And then you have a series of evocative names. The Bel Air is the most current, but there were the cars that got you there. So of course, Wildwood has a Packard motel, a Thunderbird motel, and of course the Bel Air that, as you see itself, has kind of dual meanings. The doo-wop music heritage of Wildwood in this Ebb Tide motel spans from the 1937 movie Ebb Tide all the way through Tom Jones' rendition of the Ebb Tide dating from 1971. And the tempo with its balconies that played musical notes that were presumably doo-wop tunes. Royalty, near, far, and sometimes both, the Imperial 500, the King's Inn, and in this case, a little closer to Philadelphia, the Monaco in honor of Princess Grace. We had exotic destinations, again, near and far, from Florida to the Caribbean. So we had the Eden Rock and the Hialeah, bringing Florida a bit closer to Philadelphia, the Caribbean, of course, and the Tahiti. Sometimes the exotic and current events overlapped. with Hawaii's statehood, as you see here. And we had the frontiers, both the new frontier, the space frontier in our space race. And you see on the right, the old frontier in the world of TV Westerns. With the end of the 20th century in sight, by the late 1990s, there was a sudden rediscovery of what we have come to know as the doo-wop motels of the Wildwood. Mark Havens, who you'll hear from shortly, through his photo, is a true preserver of the Wildwoods. As he put it, thanks to a combination of economics, geography, and chance, these themed accommodations were frozen in time. In 1997, the Society for Commercial Archaeology held its 20th anniversary meeting in Wildwood. Finn's family fun and the fabulous 50s brought together activists and scholars from across the country who reveled in the buildings and the nostalgia associations they evoked. We published the first comprehensive inventory and guidebook of the island's over 300 motels for this conference. This in turn spawned serious academic study as a series of learning from design studios sponsored by the University of Pennsylvania, Yale, and Kent State Universities, along with the Doo-Wop Preservation League, emerged under the leadership of Stephen Eisenor. Steve kept us on the straight and narrow, if often irreverent road. He always made the journey fun. His enthusiasm was infectious. The group that I led started out by focusing on the motels, and first as individual buildings and then in groupings. We documented about 30 motels and measured drawings delineated to HAB standards. Then, determined to understand how the buildings sent the powerful signals that they did, and learning from Las Vegas, we developed a motel physiognomy, which included the sign, where the sign alone communicates the motel's theme, a gift wrap or painted or mosaic, usually on one wall only, that conveyed the message. It's akin to a Tyvek wrap with an iconography, for those of you familiar with seeing buildings going up. The emblem carries that logo a little deeper, but not terribly deep, as you can see. And then ducks were the full 3D representation of whatever the image was being conveyed. The architectonic duck is a little more self-referential. We did a final study. The studios did a final study, and our bottom line was not to be too polite in either our graphics or our analysis of what we saw. Ultimately, we identified motel neighborhoods, significant clusters that coherently told the story of Wildwood evolution. And here you see a map. And we also identified the areas in between these neighborhoods and designated them for potential new development. This strategy included encouraging bright lights, sign minimums rather than maximums, and idiosyncratic resort imagery. While the imagery of a bygone era's popular culture had a nostalgic charm, we encouraged both updating and playing with this imagery as a way to keep the mix of the past and the present that would ensure a viable future. The Memory Motel, that was fashioned in 1998, is laden with allusions to the Rolling Stones, Mick Jagger, and by extension to Andy Warhol. It brought together the popular culture of the mid-70s to the 1950s motel neighborhood. The Palms was a proposal to combine the Jolly Roger, that you'll see far more elegant photos of in a few minutes with the beachfront high-rise across the street. And this was an attempt to tie the two together and make a more efficient and cohesive and updated design that had an entirely new imagery superimposed on it. The areas in between the proposed motel neighborhoods, or dead zones, were critical to the future. Could there be a way to employ the techniques that made the Wildwoods what they were applied to contemporary development? Victorian era houses had given way to bungalows that in turn gave way to motels that evolved from compact corner affairs to high rises lining the beach. While we could not anticipate what the next type would be, we could accommodate it. Whatever this future development, since owners of existing motels in designated neighborhoods should not be denied the potential for the rewards of new development, a system of transfer development rights would have to be implemented. Not only would this prioritizing strategy entail letting go of part of the Wildwoods, but it brought with it a significant logistical challenge. That made traditional preservation and potential National Register listing appear to be a simpler and their more attractive alternative. As a result, the Doo-Wop Preservation League chose to pursue this more traditional preservation strategy. Preserving this fragile fabric, however, proved elusive. By one estimate, while close to 300 Doo-Wop buildings have been demolished in the last 20 years, several have been listed on the National Register. Fragments of lost motels have been preserved at the Doo-Wop Museum, itself the dismantled and reassembled Surfside Cafe, an iconic carousel-like beachside eatery dating from 1960s. While not preserved in situ, the vibrancy of the Wildwoods is still evident here, albeit at a pedestrian, not a vehicular scale. Finally, within the last few years, a new, more inclusive approach has emerged. We are trying to pick up the pieces to figure out a preservation strategy that works, explained Taylor Henry, chairperson of Preserving the Wildwoods. This group, which recognizes the diversity and breadth of the Wildwoods history and building stock, is responsible for getting the Wildwoods recognized as one of New Jersey's 10 most endangered places a few years ago. Within the past few years, they successfully concluded a GoFundMe campaign to save a far more modest, but equally iconic, if less celebrated, part of Wildwood's every man's vacation saga in the form of a tiny A-frame cottage. While we lament the losses and applaud the various efforts to preserve, we must recognize the importance of a changing environment while recording the old in a manner that allows us to better read the existing landscape, a landscape that reflects who we are today. Mark Havens has done much to document the vanishing places of the Wildwoods, capturing the often unrecognized subtlety that mom and pop brought to their wild designs. A number of Mark's photographs were taken at the end of their motel's last season, just prior to demolition. As he explains, these motels were empty, not because the summer is over, but because we as a culture have moved on. And now I'll turn it over for the really beautiful images to Mark.
So if you hit share there.
Okay.
Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Havens, and it's a real privilege to be speaking to you this evening and to be alongside someone like Dan. It's a real thrill for me, and I appreciate the chance to share my project with you. It's entitled Out of Season, and it resulted in a book of the same name. And while I've had a lifelong love of modernism, I'm not an expert by any means. So I'd like to start out with a quote from Joseph Giovannini. He's an architectural historian who wrote one of the essays in the Out of Season book. He says this: Wildwood's motels can and should be interpreted as a progressive mid-century movement, pivoting modernism to a next stage, opening it to a wider audience by diversifying and broadening its subject matter. So today I'd like to show you some of the images from the work, and I know it's a little bit of a shift of gears, but talk about making the project itself, which was a 12-year process. In a way, though, the project actually began for me in 1949 with these two folks, my grandmother and my aunt. My grandmother passed away several years ago at age 92, and she lived every year of her life in the town of Gloucester, New Jersey. And Gloucester is an industrial port town right across the river from Philadelphia. It's tight and it's cramped and urban, and in the summer it is hot. But for one day out of the summer every year, my grandmother and my aunt would take the Cape May Reading Seashore Lines train from the little station in Gloucester down through southern New Jersey, past the suburbs and towns to the farmlands and the pine forests and the salt marshes, and finally out across what was then a long rickety wooden bridge to a tiny barrier island, and that barrier island was called Wildwood. This is what things looked like back then. And over the decades, that day trip turned into a weekend stay, and a weekend stay eventually turned into a week. And back in 1971, my family started going down as a group for a week of vacation every August. And like many families, it grew into a major tribal gathering, grandparents and great-grandparents, aunts and uncles and cousins. And I was terrifically blessed. For many years when I was a kid, we had 4 generations of my family around the breakfast table every morning in Wildwood. Now, this next part doesn't make any sense unless you know a couple things about Wildwood. It's not like other beach towns along the southern New Jersey coast. It's everybody in Jersey and the Philadelphia area, for that matter, when they go down the shore, and by the way, it's always down the shore, not down to the shore. Whenever anybody goes down the shore, they always have a specific town that they always go to, and everybody's got their own town, like Cape May or Sea Isle City, Avalon, Stone Harbor, many others. But Wildwood is not like those other towns. It's like in the summer, if somebody says, "What are you doing this weekend?" and you say, "I'm going down the shore," and they go, "Oh, that's so nice. What town are you going to?" And you go, "Wildwood." You'll often get an expression like, "Oh, well, have fun with that." See, Wildwood's always been that blue-collar town by the sea. It's a little more gritty, a little more rough around the edges, and certainly not anywhere near as gentrified as neighboring towns. The beaches are still free to go on, and it still has the last great honky-tonk boardwalk in America, over 2 miles of roller coasters and pizza joints. But as Dan said, it always has had a hidden treasure, and it's, I believe, Wildwood's working class reputation that kept the treasure safe, frozen in time for almost 40 years. What Wildwood's got is the highest concentration, arguably, of mid-century modern hospitality architecture in America. It's motels. And as you've heard, the motels of Wildwood were built in the late 50s and early 60s, anticipating the arrival of the Garden State Parkway, a 4-lane toll road that would ultimately run the length of the state. And they borrowed heavily from the modernist style of motels prevalent in the 1950s in Florida, which was the winter home to many of the builders. And they were really unlike anything else along the Jersey Shore. Buildings enveloped in cake icing stucco, walking high on I-beam stilts of pink and aqua, and walls and roofs tilting bizarrely as if frozen in mid-collapse, walkways and arches spiraling upward, and strange concrete ribbons, and of course the plastic palm trees sprouting from the zigzag verandas. The builders made sure to imbue their creations with the culture of the moment: space travel, cars, nascent rock and roll, and exotic Polynesian locales too. The riot of flagcrete and steel that created had another forest above it, and that was the neon signs spelling out names like Satellite, Astronaut, Bel Air, and Konakai. So these motels were the backdrop of all my time at the shore. And to be honest with you, they were as immovable as mountains to me. I never gave them a whole lot of thought because I figured that they would always be there. But right around 2000, 2001, something started to happen. Developers who were driven by the skyrocketing property prices in surrounding beach towns and elsewhere along the eastern seaboard suddenly arrived in Wildwood. And they did what developers sometimes do. They started buying properties up and knocking them down. Motel owners who were accustomed to decades of simply scraping by suddenly found themselves offered multi-million-dollar jackpots for the sand that their motels sat on. As you could probably guess, once sold, demolition often came quickly. So the year's 2002, and I'm beginning to notice that these motels that I always thought would be there are disappearing left and right. And I'm also beginning to notice that something inside of me feels as if it's being demolished too. I'm a designer by trade, and I've always been driven to create throughout my entire life. But at the start of the project, I had no experience with photography at all, and I didn't intend to become a photographer. So what I did was I paid a professional photographer to come down to Wildwood with me and to shoot the motels that I stood there and pointed at, just to have some photos for myself, just to have something to remember. And the results were fine, but there was just something about them that wasn't getting what I was after. And to be honest with you, that's surprising. I didn't know there was anything that I was after. I thought just a bunch of photos, any photos would be fine. I was surprised that there was any sort of authorship or intent on my part, but there it was. And still, the rate of the demolitions continued to steadily increase. So after exhausting every other possibility, I grudgingly purchased a secondhand camera from a little store called Happy Photo here in Philadelphia and started very tentatively making my own photographs. And as soon as I began, it was like someone flipped a switch. I suddenly found a medium with this wondrous immediacy to it that I'd never known before. It was absolutely exhilarating for me. I felt in a lot of ways like I'd been given wings, and that was despite the photographs that I was making at the time being pretty terrible. The point was that I'd found this new form of expression that absolutely engulfed me. As I said, the demolitions were much more frequent when I began. Each time I would take a trip to the island, it seemed like I was greeted with a new dirt lot where motels had been just a few days before. And so it was a little bit of a difficult circumstance to try and learn, and a little bit like trying to figure out how to be a doctor by working in an emergency room. There was just no room for error. If I got it wrong, which I did quite a lot, there was very little chance I'd get to try again. The motels were disappearing that fast. I remember a couple of occasions during that time when I'd photograph a motel, but get some part of the process wrong somewhere and not get any usable images. And I'd return again, only to find that the motel had been demolished. For a time, it seemed like the faster the motels seemed to fall, the more I shot, and the more I shot, the faster the motels seemed to fall. Eventually, though, I began to learn, and just as importantly, I began to quantify exactly what it was that I was trying to capture. The deserted nature of the photographs, which turned into a primary component of the artistic statement I was trying to make with the project, actually started as a practical measure. I began by photographing motels during the tourist season, but I soon realized that even a single car parked in front of a motel obscured a huge amount of what I wanted to show. And I then tried photographing deep into the off season, but then the motels were fully closed up and dark, almost featureless. And eventually I figured out that there were only two very small windows when it was possible to make the images that I envisioned. just prior to the beginning of the tourist season at the beginning of May, and just after it concluded at the end of September. Only then were the lights on and the pools full and the chairs and plastic palm trees out, and yet no one was around. So once I began to shoot photographs that were devoid of people or activity of any kind, I realized that that isolation actually clarified these bold architectural forms, and more importantly, served as a sort of analog to the larger situation, which, as Dan mentioned, many of these buildings are empty, not because the summer is over, but because we as a culture, for better or worse, have moved on in a lot of ways. I realized that what I was actually trying to do was to bring out the interplay of an idealized past and its inexorable disappearance. In a lot of ways, people do inhabit these images, but only by inference and illusion. And in many ways, it's this physical absence from which the work draws its strength, I think. I discovered that the impressions are made at a more elemental depth, sort of echoing that universal of all human experiences, the passage of time and what's left in its wake. One of the things that I really grew to appreciate as I worked on the project was the combination of aspiration along with humility that I found in these buildings. They were built at a time in our culture where the possibility for your average worker to actually get away for a few days was a relatively new thing. And, you just have to look at the names of these places: the Caribbean, the Bel Air, the Waikiki, the Isle of Capri. The people who stayed in these places could never have actually afforded to go to those locales, my family included. They couldn't afford to go to the Caribbean, but they could, just barely, afford a few days on the AstroTurf around the pool at the motel version of the Caribbean in Wildwood. And I find something terribly endearing about that. Jamer Hunt, who is a professor of transdisciplinary design at Parsons, wrote another of the essays in the book, and in it he states, "For the working and middle-class families that flocked to Wildwood's motels year after year, the island was their own fantasy land. The exoticism was wallpaper thin, of course, but that didn't diminish the attraction. Wildwood was more than eye-popping extravagance. Compact, simple in plan, and cheap to build, its motels were always honest, at least. Their fakery and simulation was explicit. It was part of the deal. Beneath the glitz and glamour, though, they were modest dwellings, fitted out with details both antique and refined. And those humble, simple details really run the gamut, from color-coordinated ashtray plinths to painted parking bollards that turn huge swaths of plain concrete into design elements, to a contrasting color strategically placed in the vinyl strapping of a patio chair to accentuate the line of a window. And all of it with the goal of differentiating your motel from the others. So this is the Surf Haven Motel. You can see here in the background of the neon sign, there's a vibrant, almost electric blue. So is every windowsill and room door on this motel. And when I was photographing it, the owner came out to me. The first thing he said was, he looked at me with my camera, he said, "You like that blue, huh?" And I pointed, and he pointed to the sign. And at first I didn't know what he meant. He said, "You see that blue? I get that blue mixed especially for me. Nobody else has it. You won't find another blue like that anywhere on the island." It wasn't so much the motel itself was what he was proud of. It was the way that he'd found to differentiate it from all the others in this simple and profound way. And that manipulation of detail sometimes is incredibly ingenious. There's lots of examples throughout the island of this sort of clever way that owners found to distinguish their motels from others. This is the Monaco, a motel that during the day at least appears to be a fairly straightforward 50s vintage Wildwood motel. Now, the balconies of the Monaco, like many others, are equipped with overhead lights atop every door. But the owners of the Monaco replaced the standard frosted lenses of the lights with sheets of colored acrylic. And through that single intervention, on a nightly basis, the building, parking lot, and the entire corner of the block out into the middle of the street is drenched in this cloud of incredibly rich orchid light that's distinctive from every other one of its competitors. This is the Flame Inn, and more specifically, the 10-foot tall stucco and neon candle that used to be out front of the Flame Inn. This place is gone now, but the manager was a guy named Ed that I talked to quite a bit. A number of times over the course of the project, we'd have conversations, and he used to say, these owners, they don't know what they've got, Mark. I'll never forget the last time that I photographed the flame. Ed came out and he said, come here inside, I want to show you something. And he took me into the tiny little motel office, and inside behind the counter on the wall were two long bookshelves, and lined up on the bookshelves from one end to the other were photo albums. And he took one down and handed it to me, and inside, painstakingly laid out, were page after page of snapshots of families that used to come there for a couple of days vacation every summer. And as you turn the pages, you could see all of the babies of these families growing into kids, and the kids growing into teens, and teens into adults, and getting married and having children of their own and coming down, parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And as I looked through these photo albums, Ed said, this is what's being lost down here. This is what we're losing. 2 weeks later, the Flame Inn was demolished, and this image was taken that last night that the flame sign was ever lit. See, Ed recognized that it wasn't so much the buildings themselves as much as it was what those buildings enabled to happen. They gave a place for multiple generations to come together, for memories, for family traditions to be made. And these places really embrace that. I'm going to continue to show a couple more images of the motels I've captured while I talk a little bit about what changed in Wildwood in the latter portion of the project. When the housing bubble burst in 2007, the recession stopped the full-scale demolitions dead in their tracks by and large. But as the economy eventually started moving again, so did Wildwood. And at that point, the wholesale change began to come in a different form, what I've taken to calling a sort of condoization. A motel will be purchased, and instead of demolition, all of its identifying characteristics will be removed. The neon sign will be taken down. The ornate metal railings will be removed in favor of code-compliant PVC or the like. The building's usually given a peaked shingle roof and swathed in beige vinyl siding. And each motel room is then sold as its own mini condominium. Of the more than 400 motels that dotted the 5-mile-long island at the peak of the era, by my count, less than half are now standing in any form. And for many of those that are left, the future remains in doubt. Still, there are a number of bright spots, motels like the Caribbean, the Bel Air, Shalimar, and Imperial 500. They really demonstrate that it's possible to maintain their unique characteristics while updating to offer more of what current vacation goers expect. But it takes an owner with vision and an awareness of the key differentiators of what they have and a sort of curatorial approach to them. I'd like to end with another quote from Giovannini's essay. He wrote this about the overall value of these places. These buildings were open rather than closed, public rather than private, extroverted rather than introverted, populist rather than elitist, and temperamentally exuberant rather than self-contained. The motels were not just commercial ventures aimed at a bottom line. They were imaginative and even brave efforts at pushing modernism to another stage in its evolution. The unique circumstances of Wildwood made it a petri dish of architectural experimentation. Wildwood provided a culture and a context in which modernism could mutate. This mid-century modern city on the Jersey Shore marks a high moment in American commercial architecture, when in what seems like a process of spontaneous combustion, industrial modernism was given imagery, narrative, and new direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel and Mark. That was an unbelievably evocative presentation. I was getting a little misty actually during some of the pictures that you were showing there. It's such a shame to see these things go. We've had quite a few questions, and there's also a large number of comments that are talking about how much people have enjoyed this presentation and how wonderful the photography is. So you'll see all those when I send the comments to you later on tonight. But there are a few questions, and so maybe I'll just pose a few of them right now. Let's see. The first one was, it was actually for you, Mark. It was the postcard that you showed right after you showed the picture of your grandmother and your aunt. Somebody asked the question, what's the date of that postcard, if you have any idea?
I believe it was 1948 or 1949.
Okay, all right, so that's pretty good. Another question was, says Stephanie actually, Stuckey posed this question. She said, the show reminds me of the SCA lecture on John Margolis, where he'd wait for hours, even days, to get an image without cars obstructing them or just the right light. That's what makes these images so stark and stunning, the absence of modern cars and people. Did you have any comment on that, Mark?
Yeah, that was something that, as I mentioned, sort of evolved throughout the course of the project. You know, I had thought when I began the project that, you know, summertime was it. That was the time to shoot these places that, you know, are in full swing. But you know, when they're there, they're places that are designed for people, and the people, you know, park their cars and SUVs and they throw their beach towels over the railings. And, you know, it was very difficult for me to show any of the architecture. And then the project swung the other way, where I thought, okay, well, if I can't get it in the summer, I know there's a 9-month off season where they even turn the traffic lights off in Wildwood. I'll just get everything I need then. But the lights were out, the chairs were taken in, the palm trees were taken down, and the pools were drained. And while that modality of Wildwood and the motels, I think, has a stark beauty all its own, it wasn't what I was after either. And so that's where, after a couple of years, and this is one of the reasons the project took so long, was that it's really just 2 weeks at the beginning and end of the season, the sort of shoulder seasons that you can that you're able to shoot, and that there's an owner still there to make friends with and ask to take their one remaining car out of the parking lot and park it across the street, or keep the neon sign on for another 10 minutes because they're all on timers. And so that was something that sort of grew throughout the project.
Okay. Gerald Martin asks the question, have any modernism conferences and or festivals been held in Wildwood as a way to focus attention on the heritage? And the similar things apparently have happened in Palm Springs, California.
Not recently. I think the Doo-Wop Preservation League had some events. I know they tried to encourage preservation by issuing a handbook on how to best preserve your Doo-Wop motel, but I don't think anything in relatively recently has taken place like that. It's a good idea, though.
Okay. There's a few questions here about whose kitten is making such a ruckus in the back here. That's my cat, and I put her outside the room because she was threatening to make a commotion, and now she's upset and disappointed. I guess she wants to see the rest of the presentation. Anyway, sorry about that. There's a good comment from Michael Hirsch, who of course is, as you know, president of the SCA and very involved in Wildwood, in a Doo-Wop Preservation League. He makes the comment, historically significant and not protected. Could you talk about why is there no ability to historically designate these buildings and protect them?
It's a good question. The Wildwoods are really made up of at least three distinct municipalities. And the governments are very independent, and the constituents for the government are really kind of transitory. So getting a local designation is very, very difficult. So when the decision was made not to proceed with a very cumbersome approach that would have involved the transfer development rights, the decision was made to go to national register listing only with no local designation. And all that does is it does not actually it doesn't really protect the buildings from demolition. The only way to protect a building from demolition is by not issuing a demolition permit. And that's something that only the local government could do. And for a series of reasons, it never happened in any of the municipalities. So what ended up happening was just the National Register. And so there are tax incentives for preserving and no mechanisms for preventing demolition.
Okay. I have this is a representative comment. There's dozens of them on here. It's from Michael Eisno. He says, if all the mics were open, as you know, everybody's been muted except yourselves, you'd be hearing a ton of applause, a terrific presentation. And there's lots of comments like this. You'll see them later. Stephanie Stuckey poses a good question. I don't know if you can answer it. Mark referenced a few hotels that had been well preserved. Which ones would you recommend that we stay at if we wanted to visit?
I think any of the ones that were mentioned are doing a fantastic job of maintaining their sort of uniqueness while updating for the 21st century. The Caribbean is always one that's the go-to. Right across the street is the Bel Air, which is similarly lovingly maintained. The Shalimar is a great one. The Shalimar has actually pulled off the feat of adding an additional story to the top of the building while maintaining that whole 1950s feel and all of the uniqueness of the facade and the materials. They've done a great job. The Imperial 500 is great. Those are the ones that come to mind for me first.
I'm glad the Bel Air is still there.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, and our viewers tonight have a bunch of their own suggestions, so you'll see those that are in the chat as well. Some of the same ones that you mentioned. An interesting comment by Allison Baker. She says, you touched on this a bit about the vicarious ability / fantasy of traveling to places like the Caribbean or Hawaii by going to the Wildwoods. So I'm particularly interested in the quote tropical ideal of the themed motels that represented Hawaii, the statehood especially, Tahiti, the Caribbean, etc. Do you delve further into this in your book?
Not any further than the photographs that were already shown. Some of the features of those motels at the time that I was photographing had gone away. One of the things that stands out to me is the Konakai, which was actual lava rock facade motel. It had these gas-fired tiki torches on every corner of the building. And I mean, when those were cranked up, I mean, it was a street corner to remember in Wildwood. Unfortunately, the summer that I was able to photograph it was the actual last summer that the motel was standing. So yeah, there's a huge array of the sort of Polynesian feel motels. One of the ones that's still there is the Royal Hawaiian, which I did not include in the photography tonight, but it's got an analog of that sort of famous revolving restaurant above Waikiki. It's got sort of this flying saucer windowed top to it. And there's some of the Polynesian, I would say the Polynesian motels were some of the ones that took all of the placemaking to the furthest extent, and the gas torches and the top of the Royal Hawaiian are two aspects that come to mind.
Okay. I don't know if the audience can see Daniel because we're using your computer, Mark. I can see Daniel, but I think people need to see Daniel, what Daniel's wearing. So there you go. He's got his Wildwood shirt on.
This is a Maury's shirt. If I were able to operate equipment, I could operate any of the rides right now.
Oh, that's great. I'm glad you're dressed for the occasion. Daniel, would you like to, well, I have a question, and then my question is, I guess probably more for Daniel, and that is, in many areas of especially of the USA, that you find that the motels, and we talked a lot about how the motels are disappearing because the developers are buying them up, turning them into condos, or they are being turned into condos as is. But do you have the situation of the motels just being abandoned and left to rot and basically turning into derelict buildings?
I don't think that happened at all. I mean, I think, you know, the neglect was a very benign neglect. Things kept running and the motels kept operating, but there were no abandoned motels. I think then the real problem in terms of preservation became the pressure to redevelop. But I think mom and pop or their families really, by and large, kept all the motels operating fairly successfully.
Okay. Interesting. That's good news because I just came back from a trip to Detroit, and I don't know if you've been there. It's certainly not the Wildwood. It's not a tourist destination. Well, it is, but not the same way. And of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of buildings that are just derelict, and it's heartbreaking to see it. But anyways, so that's good news. Dana Scott says, great presentation. The sitcom Schitt's Creek sparked a reinterest in old school motels. It's too bad it came after some of these were destroyed. And I might say that Schitt's Creek is a Canadian production, so that's good. But Stephanie poses a good question. Another one. Wildwoods reminds me of Tucumcari, New Mexico, is a town where classic motels still survive. Also, Myrtle Beach and Manitou Springs come to mind as towns that have amazing mid-century modern motels. So are there any other towns you'd recommend like this?
We are anxious for any recommendations. I think Mark's camera travels, and we would like to compile a listing and maybe kind of brief description of comparable motels. In fact, that was one of the challenges of Wildwood. When it wound down, we were so wrapped up in the unique qualities of Wildwood that we were really thinking, where else does this occur? And what kind of regional differences does it bring with it? So if they're in the chat or if people are willing to contact us and reach out to us, I think that would make for a great project.
Okay, well, somebody mentions Wisconsin Dells in Wisconsin, Breezewood, Pennsylvania. The one I thought of, which is a sad example, is I was recently in Miami Beach and spent a lot of time biking around there, and you see a very few old style motels left, especially along the beach strip, and everything else has been replaced by towering condos. So it's, I mean, I don't know that Wildwood would go as far as that, but it's a precursor of, or it's an indication of what might come, except that's a little different situation down there because of the winter, I guess.
Yeah.
Mark, do you want to, I wish you would, do a little promo for your book? Like, how can people get it?
Oh, sure. It's it's called Out of Season, and it's published by Booth Clibborn Editions and distributed by Abrams Books out of New York. It's available on Amazon. But unfortunately, Booth Clibborn Editions went out of business during COVID. And so while it is available on Amazon, it's definitely not the sticker price that we envisioned anymore. I am looking to reprint the book in a second edition, augmented with some additional photographs. The project over the 12 years ended up topping right around 13,000 images that were shot, and there's only, I think, 126 in the book. So we dearly love to reprint the book in a second sort of expanded edition. And yeah, if anyone knows of an entity that would be interested in republishing the book, that's what we're looking for right now. But it is available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and other resellers, eBay, lots of places. But Booth Clibborn is out of business as a result of COVID, so we're looking to reprint.
Okay, well, thanks very much. I'm sure you'll be getting a few orders for that. There's a bunch more comments here, but it's getting late, 10 after 9. We hit 98 viewers tonight, which is very good for SCA presentation. We try to get over that 100, but we were almost there. But we're down to 82 now, and people start leaving. So I'm going to end the presentation, but I just want to thank you two again for an absolutely top-notch episode tonight of the SCA Zoom presentations. And I'd also like to remind everybody about next month, when on Wednesday, June the 21st at 8 Eastern, we will host Professor Thomas Zeller, who will present a talk based on his book, Consuming Landscapes: What We See When We Drive and Why It Matters. He will talk about how the view from our cars reflects our view of societies and ourselves. And SCA members will be receiving the relevant details and registration link by email, and others can easily register through the SCA website directly. Thank you, everyone who came out and gave up an hour and a bit of their time tonight to spend some time with us, and especially to the people from Docomomo and the Society of Architectural Historians and the Doo-Wop Preservation League. And you can expect an email shortly from me inviting you to join the SCA if you enjoyed tonight's presentation, and then you can enjoy all the benefits of membership. So everyone, please be reminded that there is a recording that will be on the SCA's website. Well, it's usually up by tomorrow morning. Our web people are extremely efficient. And anybody can watch it there by going to the SCA's website, sca-roadside.org. So if you have friends and relatives that couldn't be here tonight, they can certainly watch it then. We have 21 more comments, so you guys have a lot of reading to do tonight once we're finished. Any final words from Mark and Dan?
No, I just wanted to say I'm looking at all the guests, and I'm duly grateful and embarrassed. So all the Wildwood followers who I lost track of, thank you so much. And maybe this will be something we can reconnect on.
And also, a lot of the motels have been demolished, but there's plenty in Wildwood left to save. And I just want to, take this opportunity with all these people who know and love the Wildwoods on the call, just to say thank you for all of your efforts to preserve what's left. It's worth it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with those good words, I will thank you again on behalf of the SCA, and I'll bid all our viewers a good night and hope to see you again next month. Good night.
Thanks.